They say that people who have an uncanny skill in looking after plants and breeding them and rearing them have green fingers. I don't know what the equivalent is for people who have extraordinary skill in caring for animals, persuading animals to breed. But whatever it is, the person who has more of it than anybody I know is Gerald Durrell. I first met him back in the 1950s. He had been a trainee keeper in a zoo, but he was not satisfied with that kind of life, and he decided that he would like to collect animals himself from the wild and keep them himself. He was sitting in South America, in Patagonia, when I met him, and he was surrounded by a huge collection of the most extraordinary animals, armadillos and anacondas and parrots, all kinds of things. But he was not happy at handing these over to another zoo. He wanted his own zoo. He wanted to look after animals in his own particular way. And with extraordinary bravery, and I guess looking back on it, he probably wonders how he had the nerve, he decided he would set up his own zoo. And he did that in Jersey. And that soon became the headquarters of an institution that since then has become world famous and has had a major effect on the cause for conservation, the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust.
Inside me, I am 12 years old, and yet I know that outside me I'm disintegrating like an oak tree. And I also don't believe in me, whereas other people do believe in me. I don't think that I'm famous. I don't think that I've done anything very remarkable. And so it embarrasses me when people sort of overload me with praise and so on. I think I don't deserve it.
Perhaps Gerald Durrell's greatest contribution to conservation was his ability to get people who'd never thought about conservation interested in wildlife. And I think that was the talent that came through his ability to write, to transfer his enthusiasm for wildlife onto the printed page for people who probably never stopped to think about it before. Quite an astonishing talent to awaken people's interests in a way that they'd never had done before. And with the humour that I fear was probably missing with some of the more serious intents of conservation.
I once spent an afternoon with a so-called novelist who's supposed to be interested in life, you know. Novelists supposed to be interested in life, so few of them are. And he didn't seem to want to talk. We were having a picnic under the trees in Corfu, actually. So I did my normal thing. I just lay on my tummy and looked straight down, and I was looking at New York City, as far as I was concerned. And after about a quarter of an hour, he said, "What are you looking at?" And I said, "Well, all these insects, look, there's a spider there, there's this, that, and the other." And he immediately got his, he said, "I didn't realize that I was sitting on all that sort of stuff." You know, but there's enchantment wherever you go. Enchantment in the blossoming of a flower, the flight of an insect, a bird, the song of a bird. If you look at the colors on a St. Lucian parrot, for example, each feather is a miracle in itself. And the whole shape of the bird is a miracle. And when you think that birds came from reptiles, which are things that most people don't like, it's quite extraordinary sort of transformation. But reptiles in their own way are fascinating too. The lizards and other reptiles, the tortoises and so on, are miraculous pieces of machinery, you know, which we, with all our talents, all our cunning, could not reproduce. You can't build a tortoise. You can't build a bird. And that is what we've always got to remember, that if we destroy it, we can't recreate it. I don't think anybody would believe this, but I am actually shy. When I was, about 16, I suppose, I took up smoking because it gave me something to do with my hands when I entered a room full of people because I was shy. It was a silly thing to do. Animals don't demand anything of you. People do. And I think that's where shyness creeps in, because with people, you have to be on your best behavior, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. Animals accept you exactly as you are, and you don't have to put on any show for them. I think that's probably what made me feel more comfortable with the other animals.
He had this idea, apparently, that he wanted his own zoo when he was 6. Then the whole idea of conserving wildlife, which got introduced into his idea of the zoo very, very early on, way before anyone else thought of it. It's an extraordinary achievement. And then in 1959 he opened this place. And now, and I'm hearing this more and more because I've got quite interested in zoos, the other zoos in the world are regarding this as the model.
In his younger days, he really was an animal collector, and perhaps some people would say, oh, you know, he was one of the destroyers. He went around collecting these animals. So called David Attenborough in Zoocraft, David Bellamy making programs about plants, and gathering them up and enthusing about them, and making people want to go and see these things. But he is so understanding. I mean, he understands society. He was part of a family, and he understands that every organism he looks at is part of another family, and he's got to be able to understand that family life before he can impose any form of captivity.
I'm the most uneducated man in the world, probably. I never went to school. I never passed any exams. Any qualifications that I have are entirely spurious, because they've been given to me by universities or whatever. But I decided that what I wanted, since I knew that I was totally uneducated, I wanted a life with animals, and I wanted to see the world. And the only thing that presented itself to me at that time was to become an animal collector, which is what I did. And it was by doing that that I learnt about the world and the destruction of the world and so on. And that gave me the motivation to start this place. Up till then, I thought that zoos were simply convenient places which contained a lot of animals for my edification. I didn't realize that they had a purpose. And even the zoos didn't realize that they had a purpose in those days. When we first started, of course, we had virtually no money, and we had to build cages out of chicken wire, old crates, anything. And we also had a variety of animals to try and bring people to come and see what we were doing and hopefully support us. They were not necessarily animals that were in urgent need of help. Things like tapirs, peccaries, and so on. But in those days, we never knew where the last penny was coming from. And I seemed to spend more time in my bank manager's office pleading for yet another overdraft than I did actually in the zoo. Well, eventually, we managed to improve conditions, and we got to the stage where we could build something as magnificent as our new gorilla enclosure. And we thought that we would ask David Niven to come and open it for us. Well, David, although being a consummate actor and a charming man, didn't know very much about wildlife. But I think his visit here to open our gorilla enclosure gave him some sort of an insight, because after that he became a real conservationist.
I was in New York, and I went on 2 or 3 of those talk shows, which I rather enjoyed doing. And I talked about this, but unfortunately, knowing very little about what I'm talking about, as you can see. But I did bring up one thing, which rather rocked them, I think. I said that the proud emblem of this great United States, the bald eagle, the American eagle, the bald eagle, will be gone in about 10 years, apparently. They go on slaughtering it the way they are now. And I said, it won't be awful. Some small boy will say to his father, "Dad, what's that funny-looking bird on the back of the $1 bill?" And the father will say, "It was before my time, son."
Another Hollywood star that came and helped us by opening our new nocturnal house was Jimmy Stewart. And of course, he was exactly in person as he was on the screen. Absolutely charming man. But he had very positive views about conservation before he came here.
When you talk about endangered species and so on, there's no way that you can save the animals, in my opinion, unless people understand them and people know a little bit more about the wild animals of the earth. And that I've gotten to feel that the human creature isn't the only creature on earth with any rights. And perhaps the other living creatures in the earth have a right to existence too.
In 1976, we opened our brand new and very beautiful reptile house. And Princess Anne, who was our patron, came over to open it for us. I said to her that, reptiles generally get a very bad press. Ever since the Garden of Eden, they've got a bad press. And so let's try and say something nice about them, which she did indeed. We try and keep her visits as informal as possible. And I remember sitting with her talking about reptiles while we had all our baby gorillas gambling about at her feet.
Our reptile breeding program is going to be one of the most important because in the majority of zoos, nobody else does it, yes. Well, they just stick them into little cages, and they just lie there.
Is there any particular reason why they don't do it? Because I know they do.
I think it's because most reptile houses in the past were designed purely as show boxes, and not as breeding areas.
And never really dawned on them there might be a necessity to breed them at all anyway.
Yes.
Jeremy Mallinson, of course, came here for a temporary job. That was 30-odd years ago. And he is now our zoological director, and with his, what I call his Duke of Wellington nose, which is very impressive. He goes around and makes sure that every animal is treated properly, because he treats all animals as though he'd given birth to them himself. Apart from our working relationship in the zoo, we have a very personal relationship, friendship. In fact, he was the best man at my wedding.
I've been one of his disciples. I'd hate to tell him that, but I've been one of his main disciples for over 34 years now. His vision is absolutely fantastic and obviously integrity. He expects impeccable manners, expects absolute allegiance, high motivation, and also great enthusiasm. I think people without enthusiasm, it's rather like canker, it rots the whole damn system. So certainly he expects a very professional job from everybody he involves himself with.
John Hartley came to us straight from school, and of course he went through all the different animal sections in the zoo, and eventually ended up by being my personal assistant. He's been on expeditions with me all over the world.
There are, of course, two sides to a person like Gerald Durrell. You know, there's this affable, humorous side, but one also has to remember that he's an artist, and he has a flash point, and there are times when that flash point is fairly low. I think a short fuse is the... perhaps the best way that one can describe that is we will occasionally get a letter which will really make him extremely angry. And he will call in Joan, his secretary, and he'll dictate a reply. And I'll get a look at it, and I think, my goodness, you know, he can't send this. Because what he's done is he's poured out all this anger into this letter. I then have the job of sort of, you know, picking the right moment and trotting along and saying, well, you know, you're absolutely right. This bloke deserved everything you said. However, I think, you know, paragraphs 3 and 4 could be toned down a little bit. And then, of course, he'll redictate it. Now, out will come something that will still be tough, but perhaps less aggressive.
I don't suffer fools gladly, but I try not to. I try not to embarrass people or be nasty to people unnecessarily, unless they're nasty to me, of course. Then I bring out my saber. It's probably Quentin Bloxham, otherwise known as Q, who's received on occasions, probably quite unnecessarily, the sharp edge of my tongue. But we're still friends, and I have an enormous respect for him.
When I first started working here, in fact, all the staff that are still here now, which includes, I think, 2 or 3 of the executive staff, were all involved in practical animal management. We all mucked out cages and prepared animal food. And in those days, even Gerald Durrell was involved in a certain amount of the practical work. But of course, he also had to carry the responsibility of keeping the trust going, because he initially started out of his own pocket. That must have been a tremendous strain. He had very, very strongly perceived ideas of how he wanted the trust to develop and which direction he wanted to go in. And if you happen to be involved in situations where it didn't match the way that he felt it should be developing, then he was very intolerant and probably justifiably. It was a safety valve for him, I'm sure. But he never would ever leave things lie and fester. That's the way people would become resentful, and that was never the case. He would always make a point of joining up with you to explain exactly why. And that made it very easy to accept the outbursts when they came along.
You go up this side, down the other. From here, you've got to catch a rope, which is going to be hanging from the structure
Simon
here.
Hicks is our trust secretary. He's one of the comparatively new boys, but he's so full of energy. I mean, it's like a hive of bees, you know. Being near him, you can hear him throbbing with energy.
All right, along the balancing beam.
He has the independence of spirit and mind to cut through all the dross and quite simply say, I don't see what the problem is. Why don't we breed these animals in zoos? And the rest of the scientific world goes, ha, ridiculous, I've ever heard you say stupid. He'll say, why don't we build ourselves a sort of mini university? And then we can teach everybody from all over the world. And everybody says, but the money, you know, and what are you going to do? How can you teach this as a practical Where's the theory? Etc., etc. And he just has this ability of just going straight to the nub of the matter.
I thought to myself that there were some animals which were so on the brink of extinction that what they needed was a sanctuary. And whether the sanctuary was here in Jersey or in Africa or wherever, it didn't matter. But what they needed was the protection of captivity. Captivity is a very unfortunate word. I hate it. But that's the only way I can explain it. In order to give them security, the advantage of veterinary services, unfailing food supplies, and so on. And the only way you can do that is by keeping them in captivity. And there weren't enough people doing that. In fact, there was practically nobody doing that. And so I decided that that was the way we would have to go. I first met Lee when I went to America to see the collection of lemurs at Duke University. And I discovered that what she'd been studying was animal communication, which is a thing that I'm very interested in too. And so we started to communicate. And then eventually I got her over here, to come over here and see the zoo and everything.
He got me over on a total pretext, actually. He promised, he said, oh, you want to continue your researches in animal communication. Well, I'm just thinking of setting up a sound laboratory at the zoo, and I'll have all sorts of fancy recording equipment. I was interested in vocal communication. Would you like to come over and help me set this up? And of course, the whole thing was a ruse. It was just a ruse to get me over to see Jersey.
Well, I mean, you couldn't say to a lovely lady like this, when you're a carunculated old wreck like me, you couldn't say to her, look, I'll pay your way over to Jersey, come and have a look, see what you think of it. She'd immediately suspect something. So I had to think of a method of doing it. Anyway, she married me for my zoo. I'm the only man in the universe that's been married for his zoo.
My own view is that it is of enormous importance to people to be able to come to zoos and see animals, which must be kept in the best possible conditions, of course, but to actually see them. Because a warning to the guys across the river. Because when I see animals, I get a marvelous range of reactions to them: affection, fascination, respect, amusement, and above all, a lot of the time, a sense of wonder, which I don't think we get in our ordinary urban lives.
There's nothing quite like the scale and the appearance and the thing that never comes out on television, which is the smell of wild animals or birds or anything else.
I realized that most zoos, in fact, were going in for spectacular animals. You know, if they had elephants, they had rhinoceros, they had giraffe, they had all these things. And yet there were a whole mass of smaller creatures which needed help, which were not crowd pullers. And I felt sorry for them. They were the sort of small and ugly ones which were being pushed aside. Nobody took any interest in them. So I decided they needed a bit of help.
We do, of course, have certain crowd pullers ourselves. I mean, we have a lowland gorilla family, which the public like enormously, particularly the male, Yambo. He, in fact, probably has done more for gorilla publicity, if you like, than any other gorilla in the world, because a small boy fell into the enclosure and Yambo stood guard over him until we could get him out. And this story, of course, went all over the world. And it went to sort of undermine that awful Hollywood picture of the gorilla beating its chest and carrying off the blonde, you know. Yambo was gentle, refined. He was a gentleman, in fact. Sadly, Yambo died recently, and we now have Wequanza of Melbourne. This underlines the way that zoos all over the world are cooperating now, so that if we need a gorilla, a male gorilla or a female gorilla, we can go to Melbourne in Australia, we can go to America, and we will get what we want. Now, he has arrived, and he's a beautiful animal, and we're hoping that all the girls will fall desperately in love with him, and so he will take part of Yambo eventually.
What Jerry did, we showed them that animals especially aren't just cuddly, wonderful, furry things that we should look at and think about, but they are integral parts of the living world on which we all depend. And of course then he's shown us, and most important of all, that captive breeding is the only hope for many of the species in this world.
Laymen, I think, don't realise that there is an enormous amount of fragility in keeping animals under captive conditions. You have to get the right caging, for example, the right food, and make sure that they are happy, otherwise they won't breed. Simple as that. I mean, you can't just throw a couple of gorillas into a cage and say, go on, mate, have fun. Because they just won't do that unless they actually fall in love. I mean, I have witnessed this here in Jersey with our gorillas.
Finally, when you achieve the results, then you can start talking about putting them back into the wild. But when you are putting them back into the wild, of course, you have to train them all over again. You have to teach an animal to behave like a wild animal, because here they're loved and cosseted and they've got every sort of amenity. And then you can't just toss them out into the wild like that, because they wouldn't survive. You've got to teach them how to survive in the wild. I mean, people talk a lot of nonsense about animals in the wild being so happy and carefree and all that sort of thing, but in fact it's not true. Being a wild animal is a very difficult job.
The reintroduction of the golden-eyed tamarins in Brazil into full-size trees with branches that droop at the edges. For many of the youngsters who were not properly educated, i.e. that the contents of their cages did not have droopy ends to their branches, had several potentially rather nasty accidents when they literally ran out of space and fell off the end because they hadn't learnt to cope with bendy branches. This didn't happen to the Jersey golden-eyed tamarins because they had been properly educated in branches which did the natural thing and got thinner and thinner at the ends.
I think what the animal likes to do, the celebes, for example, I was watching them yesterday, playing with each other, fighting with each other and so on, and I think that's what they want to feel. They want to feel real earth under them and real plants around them, not plastic plants. I think one of the greatest highlights happened quite recently when I went to Mauritius to see our pig pigeon and kestrel breeding there. And I went up to the camp where the boys in the field were working in the forest. And while we were sitting there having a mug of tea, what should come and sit in the tree above me but a pink pigeon wearing the band that we knew
was the band of one of the birds that we'd actually bred here in Jersey. Now that was an enormous thrill, enormous thrill.
When we first started with our captive breeding of pink pigeons, both in Jersey and here in Mauritius, we had to go for mass production. We had to get, with such a rare bird and such small numbers. And so we had to use foster doves. When we came to the release, apart from the problems that we have up here of monkeys taking nests and eating eggs, rats is a very large problem for us. Shortage of natural food as well, so we're having to do supplementary feeding. So on top of all those problems, we had the problem of some behavioral characteristics amongst these introduced pigeons because of the fact they were reared by fosters. So to address that, we then had got the captive population up to reasonable numbers. So we could afford to persevere with parent rearing in captivity. And so then we took out some of the released birds, and now we have 24 birds, adults, up here at Plain Lièvre, about half reared by fosters and half parent reared. And then very recently, we have had a very dramatic situation where we've had 10, possibly 11 youngsters in about the last 2.5 to 3 months. The Mauritius Kestrel is, if you like, the project that is coming near to completion, as much as you can ever say that for this sort of work. When I first came here with Jerry in 1976, the known wild population, well, there were 4 known birds, and we consider there were probably 2 or 3 others about that we couldn't find, but certainly less than 10. And through a program of, at the beginning of the breeding season, finding nests and taking the first clutch of eggs as soon as they were laid, the parents would then recycle 3 or 4 weeks later again and produce their offspring. And we took these eggs into captivity, hatched them in incubators, reared them to about 30 to 40 days, and then putting them out in groups out in the forest. And now we have a wild population of about 240 birds. We hope to put out another 50 this year. Thereafter, I think what we will be doing is monitoring the success of those birds that have been released.
The echo parakeet, of course, is gravely endangered. We think now that we have saved the pink pigeon and the kestrel, but the echo parakeet's numbers are so low, that dangerously low. So we do put out feed for them in the daytime. This whole complex operation is in the charge of Carl Jones. He's our man in Mauritius. He's a mad Welshman. Only a mad Welshman would go and do a thing like this, but he has been tremendously successful.
At the moment, there's only about a dozen left in the wild. The population is doing better than it has done, but of course it's not doing very well. And out of those 12 birds, of those 12 wild birds, there's only 3 known females. And they don't breed every year, so it's touch and go whether or not we will be able to save them.
Did anybody ever kept them alive?
Well, that's an interesting point. People have kept them before, but they've always died. And that's because we think they've fed them the wrong diet. This is always the case with endangered species. You have to start from scratch and work out what they need. But if you feed them as ordinary parakeets, they'll die because they're not seed eaters as such. In the wild, they feed on flowers, fruits, and flowers, fruits and leaves. So they have a very bulky diet. And we now feed them on a wide variety of vegetables and fruits, for example, and they seem to be doing quite well. As you know, the pink pigeon's the world's rarest pigeon, the kestrel's the world's rarest kestrel, and this is the world's rarest parrot. Yeah. So it shows what can be done in really critical situations. People have said time and time again, why bother with these critically endangered ones? Those are the ones we should work with. Those are the ones that are going to tell us how to manage critically endangered populations.
It shows also that captive breeding does work when it comes to conservation.
Our international training centre is something quite unique. It is absolutely essential that we train people and send them out to countries so that they can carry the message of conservation in those countries. We have now trained over 300 students from 70 different countries. And of course, it's essential to get the conservation message to young people so that they grow up, as it were, respecting the world. And this is what we're doing the whole time. We're teaching the youngsters here in Jersey.
You're beginning to see a growth and a spread of the influence of what is available, the experience, the pool of knowledge that's available in Jersey being spread through its training centre around the world. And hopefully you just draw attention to what can be achieved and the amount that people are actually doing in order to bring those changes about.
You'd be surprised how much we can achieve with what many people would consider to be very modest sums. We're working with a very dramatic species of lizard at the moment. It comes from St. Lucia and lives on one tiny offshore island, terribly threatened. One fire could wipe out the species. We can save that species for something like £5,000. We can train somebody from, let's say, Madagascar, who is going back to a country which is quite devastated and still manages to retain one of the most extraordinary, unique collections of animals in the world. And we can train somebody for about £3,500 to go back and to start putting his training into effect to save species in that country.
They live on the top of the forest, so don't they?
Madagascar is really one of the most important of these gigantic islands. It is so stuffed with animals that are unique, are found nowhere else. We have trained 3 people from Madagascar, but 3 people in an island that size is really a drop in the ocean. So it's still necessary for us to bring animals here to Jersey and breed them as a safeguard. And one of the most extraordinary animals we went to find on this expedition was the aye-aye, and this is what I wrote about it in my book. In the gloom, it came along the branches towards me, its round, hypnotic eyes blazing, its spoon-like ears turning to and fro independently like radar dishes, its white whiskers twitching and moving like sensors, its black hands with their thin, attenuated fingers, the third seeming prodigiously elongated, tapping deliberately as it moved, like those of a pianist playing a complicated piece by Chopin. It looked like a Walt Disney witch's black cat, with a touch of E.T. thrown in for good measure. If ever a flying saucer came from Mars, you felt that this is what would emerge from it. It was Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, come to life, whiffling through the tulgey wood. Madagascar, biologically speaking, is one of the most important areas in the world.
Certainly the animals that we're most interested in are practically 100% of them are found in Madagascar and nowhere else in the world. These are the mammals and the reptiles. But the problem there, of course, is the number of human beings that have the population's exploded in recent years. And of course, the people are destroying the forests and draining the lakes, just as people do all over the world. To find the aye-aye, I mean, the best known populations of this animal are up in the northeast of the country.
It's gravely endangered, we think, for several reasons. One is deforestation, of course. The other is it's considered by some of the Malagash to be a magic animal, and so they kill it for that reason. But it also comes into their coconut plantations and chews their coconuts up, and so they kill it for that reason too.
We had to set out from the capital city, which is right in the middle of the island, drive due east to get to the coast, and then take that road up the east coast, going north.
This was really horrific. I mean, there were potholes the size of bathtubs, and you couldn't avoid them. You had to drive through them. And I tell you, the trip didn't do me any good because I've got 2 fake hips, 2 fake eyes. I'm sort of bionic man, you know, and I'm waiting for a head transplant after going on that road. It was an incredible, difficult journey. One of the most difficult I've ever had in my life.
Anyway, we finally got up there and needed to find a proper campsite for all of us. And we came across a fantastic village. Right next to the village, there was a sort of flat area by the river, and the people were very happy to have us pitch camp there. Oh, we were looking for a month anyway, all sorts of false alarms. You know, some village would report an aye-aye in the area, and our people would go and look for it both during the day and during the night. And, you know, no good news for, I don't know, a whole month it was.
We even went to the extent, on the advice of our hunters, of getting a local sorcerer in who was supposed to be able to tell the future very well. And he said, of course, you will meet with success.
Funnily enough, it was just about 2 or 3 days after the sorcerer episode that we actually started finding them. And once we started finding them, we got our 6 within about a week. So we brought the aye-ayes back and settled them in here, and less than a year later we had the first birth. That was actually the first aye-aye born in captivity that had been conceived in captivity. So quite properly we can say the first aye-aye bred and born in captivity. And then a year later was our second birth.
Yes.
From the other
Yes.
female.
And the way they're going, we think we'll have aye-ayes coming out of our aye-ayes. This, of course, was a success story, but there is so much more to do in an island of that size with that incredible fauna.
He and I went up to the biggest lake in Madagascar that has some of its own fauna that is particularly endangered because the lake is disappearing. And the main target at that time was something called it's called a little hapalemur. There's several kinds of hapalemur in Madagascar, but this particular one is endangered. And I have now, because of my interest in Madagascar, have been put in charge of the conservation program for this animal. We've just in fact sent out a conservation education poster to be distributed around the lake, and of course that's written in Malagasy, and it has a conservation message. What's really good, it's not just the animal, but the local people have made the connection between the animal and its habitat, the animal and the fact that the lake is dying. The dying lake in turn is bad for the people because that means it can't produce as much rice as they used to have. And so the people themselves have come to see the animals as symbols of good environmental health. And if one helps the animal, basically you're helping yourself.
The next stage, as far as we're concerned, is to try and save the habitats of the creatures that we are looking after in Jersey, so that we can, at some future date, return them. We're particularly proud of what we've achieved in saving Round Island, which is an island that lies north of Mauritius.
At one time it was wooded right up to the peaks here with hardwoods, palms, beautiful vegetation, some of it endemic to the island. And then man came and did to it what he is busy doing now to all the rest of the world. By that I mean he comes in and he plunders. And so in microcosm, Round Island represents what we are doing to the whole world. First of all, they came in here and they took timber, they destroyed the seabirds and ate them. Then they did the absolutely unforgivable thing. They released the two things which you should never release on an island. that is not naturally found there. One is goats and the other is rabbits. So by the time we came here, it was really like a sort of burnt out cinder. So the first thing, obviously, that we had to do was to, first of all, rescue the reptiles that you found here, which you found nowhere else except in the mascarenes. And in order to get those away, so that even if the island decayed and fell apart and we couldn't save it, at least we did have these animals still with us. So we got the reptiles off, and we got some of the plants off, and the palm trees off. And then we set about the job of eliminating the goats and the rabbits. We were helped in all our endeavours by not only the Mauritian government, but the New Zealand government, the New Zealand Navy. We had the most extraordinary people helping us. Finally, we got rid of the rabbits and we got rid of the goats, and now the whole island is starting to come back slowly but slowly. And I reckon probably within the next 30, 50 years, we'll get it back, not quite exactly what it was, but a pretty good representation of what it was. We've saved a little bit of the world and its contents. You know, everyone keeps talking about us as a zoo. Well, all right, so we are. We're a collection of animals, and the collection of animals automatically becomes a zoo. But we have now widened our horizons. We're now going out and trying to save the habitat and the places where these animals that we are breeding in captivity are naturally found, so that we can then return them to the wild, save them, breed them, keep them safe, at the same time try and preserve the habitat, and then if they're still there to put them back into, put them back there.
One of the important aspects of the Save the Children Fund's work is the environment in which young people are going to grow up in, and that it should be able to sustain them in the long term. If it's going to sustain man, it's actually going to have to sustain wildlife as well. The two go together. They can't be mutually exclusive because it doesn't work for either of them. If you only look at improving man's conditions in the short term, the chances are that in the long term it will deteriorate for everybody. And the fund is, one of its keys is long-term sustainability.
We are not living within nature, we are living outside nature and pretending that we're God. And what we're actually doing is suicidal for all of us, not just Africa or Asia or wherever. For the whole world it's suicidal. And it's a very worrying situation. And it's very difficult sometimes to explain to people that what we all need to do is to tone it down a notch or two.
I've seen so many prophecies of doom in the last 30 years that have not come to fruition, that I'm beginning to think we just have to hang on, because the wonderful thing about life is you never ever know what's going to happen next. I mean, nobody foretold 3 years ago what was going to happen in Russia, you know, and everything is so unpredictable. And that's kind of fascinating. So I think there's hope, and the thing is to hang in there and do what we can in the meantime, in the hope that something unforeseen and good is eventually going to happen.
I'm not an optimist by nature, I don't think, but I can't not believe that if you provide the right sort of information for people, that they will in fact learn what is practical. And they will also learn what is necessary. And what is necessary is that we have to share what we have and keep that balance. And that will require an effort from us as well.
I think in the early days everybody thought I was a nut. Conservationists didn't believe in zoos, and in those days quite rightly, because most zoos were very bad and they weren't contributing anything to conservation. And so if you mentioned captive breeding to a conservationist, he'd go white and faint. So when I said, I think that zoos are important and they should be doing this kind of work, i.e. what we are doing here now, I don't think half the conservationists in the world believed in it.
But now, 30 years later, all the conservationists in the world have agreed suddenly that captive breeding is of great importance. And it's to me, it's miraculous. It's marvelous, it's wonderful. But why did it take so bloody long?
A fund in memory of Gerald Durrell, the founder of the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust, has been established to continue his life's work of saving endangered animals from extinction. If you would like to contribute to the Gerald Durrell Memorial Fund or require further information, please write to the Trust Secretary, Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust, Les Augres Manor, Trinity, Jersey, JE3 5BP.